One.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Pacific Council's webcast on trends and on green tech and energy. My name is Samantha Pettigrew. I'm an associate at the International Council on Clean Transportation, and I was graciously invited by the Pacific Council to moderate today's discussion. And I'm very excited to have Mark and Tracy with us today. Mark Kellaher currently serves as the Design Phase Manager of Energy Storage and Solutions at MA Mortenson, while Tracy Evers is Mortenson's Market Director of Power Delivery Solutions. Just as a note for our audience, your microphone will be muted and your video will be turned off for the duration of the call, but we would love to have you participate by clicking on the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to send in any questions. We'll get to the audience questions towards the end, but you're welcome to submit your questions at any point during the discussion. So now I'll start with Mark. If you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your position at Mortenson, and then we will hand it over to Tracy.
Excellent, thank you. Before we get going and do the introductions and such today though, I would like to take a second. We typically start most meetings and presentations with a safety moment. Since today we're talking about energy and power, I think it's especially important that we do have that discussion today. So I'm going to defer to Tracy. Tracy, could you lead us with a safety moment for today?
Sure. So today's safety moment is going to be, since I have no idea where our audience is from, I'm going to just talk generally about fireworks safety. We are in the summer season, and whether it's Independence or just general celebrations, there is typically greater use of fireworks. And while we all love fireworks, we inherently recognize there are some dangers. There are just one or two habits that we should be mindful of that can help to keep us more safe. One of them is to always be aware of animals, your pets, your children around fireworks. They're either very attracted to them in the case of your kids, or they're deathly afraid of them. So make sure that you have earmuffs or anything else you need for your children, in addition to reminding yourselves to keep them away, safe distance from any fireworks. The other is making sure that we have a method of putting out any catastrophe potentially. So keeping a bucket of water nearby would be a very good idea. That way you can very quickly access any water you may need to douse a flame should something occur. And of course, the third and the most important is to always follow the instructions of the manufacturers. Make sure that you're handling them appropriately to reduce the opportunity for any incident to occur. That's it.
Thank you, Tracy. So now we'll get back on track. So my name is Mark Kellaher. I am a design phase manager focusing on energy storage, electrification, and solutions. I have a background in transmission and substation industry and background in law. Tracy?
Yes, so I like to say I'm a problem solver. I've been solving different kind of problems for the last 30 years or so, ranging from my time in education to my time on Wall Street, and the last almost 20 years I've been in the power industry. For Mortenson in particular, that is exactly what I do, related to utility equipment manufacturers and others, where any issues, large projects they may be tackling, my role is to make sure that we're engaging with them, providing kind of like consulting services with the ultimate goal of building these projects for them. So back to you, Mark.
Thank you, Tracy. So today we really want to talk about trends and challenges in the clean energy transition. Today we talk a lot about clean energy and the movement from coal to renewables, distributed energy resources. But before we dive into that, I really want to hit one aspect of today's discussion. We are talking about energy and the transition and how it can be transformational in the lives of the people that it impacts. I want to relay a short story about a transmission line that I worked on. It was a public hearing, and there were some dissatisfaction. Some folks were very unhappy about the line, but at the end of the day, there was a small elderly woman who came to the forefront, and she relayed the story about back in the 1930s about the first power line that came to that area and how it transformed her life to be able to have a light bulb to study, and how this was a very impactful portion of her life. And I think we've seen it, whether it be domestically in that case or overseas in Africa, where electrification, distributed energy resources and such are really making that transformation in people's lives. And today we want to talk a little bit about that transformation, its impacts, and some of the challenges as we make a clean energy transition. So with that being said, I'm going to defer to Tracy to really get us started here today.
Yes. So to talk about where we are in terms of the green energy challenge, I think it's very important for us to take an overall look at just what are the trends that have led us to this point in the power and energy market. And I want us to think broader of not just the transfer of electrons when we talk about energy and power, but just in general, everything from the generation to the different markets in which it's used, which we typically do not consider to be power markets. So we'll walk through that. Hence, you'll see some of the trends that are popping up or trends that would not be top of mind. The power industry is facing some rapid shifts, and they're having to deal with some inherent market challenges based on the way the market was developed. And another big part of that is the fact that we're moving from this very centralized generation with fossil into this more decentralized integration of renewable energy into the grid, specific to power, and that is across the globe, irrespective of which continent we're on. Other challenges we're faced have a lot to do with the way the markets have been modeled over the years and the fact that no two markets tend to be the same from globe to globe and country to country. So these challenges are being pushed and propelled forward by some, and hence some trends are emerging as a result. And one of those trends is the fact that, data is becoming a much more important, playing a much more important role. With data, we've always known that, utilities spend quite a bit of time assessing, evaluating, and analyzing how they're using the equipment, but also how they're trading energy. Energy trading actually has become probably one of the more profitable professions in the business. And that trading has a lot to do with their ability to predict use from day to day, from hour to hour. And so if you're able to predict that, have that level of predictability, be more accurate, that's going to have an impact. So what most customers are now pushing for is they want to have real-time access, real-time evaluation, and real-time settlement of energy. So to do this, you see the movement for with more machine intelligence and machine learning to really help the utilities make the most of the data to create a more predictable pattern that will help them to reshape the way they're engaging with the market. Naturally, that means we're getting more digitized. And by being more digitized, we do have to have a way to pass that information along. So the trends that you're seeing in the information space are also impacting the power space. And that is, of course, with the emergence of 5G. 5G then allows that bandwidth to grow, so that way they can exchange that data, do more rapid computations with the artificial intelligence to generate the kind of analytics that the utilities are using to shift their new business models, which is another one of the trends that are emerging. As the markets move, like I said, to more real-time settlements, they're trying to find new models that will engage both the customers as well as the utilities themselves and the power producers, so each participant feels as if they're getting the value for their money. One of the things that's happening as we're moving, I think there's a global reduction in the consumption of energy. And outside of the space we're in right now with the global impact of the pandemic, where consumption for energy has dropped across the board globally, anywhere from 3 to 8%, we've been seeing a consistent drop because we've become much more efficient in our consumption of energy. We've been targeting the reduction of our footprint, and as a result of that, more of the equipment we use are efficient. The way we spend our time day to day, we are much more concerned about making sure we have minimal impact. Another trend that we're seeing, and we are still in the middle of this trend, Some countries would say that this is now mainstay for them, but for us in the US and elsewhere, electrification remains a trend for us. If you take a look at where we were 15, 20 years ago to where we are now, you can probably start to identify other industries or sectors in our consumption economy where we're seeing more and more electrification that we didn't before. You talk about the transportation sector being the next place where we're seeing this huge growth in electrification. And that's ranging from your personal cars, public transportation, delivery vehicles, and that goes from, planes, trains, and automobiles, all the way through to our public sector, where we're seeing more and more cities and towns adopting electric vehicle as part of their long-term city planning and their own efforts to reduce their carbon footprint. Why this becomes a bigger trend is because of this tendency and this other trend in the move to urban areas. So that is another trend that we're seeing pop up in the global power industry, where more cities are returning to being these big hubs where activity is concentrated, more people are moving closer. I think there was a study last year that came out, it might have been McKinsey, that was predicting that fewer people will own personal vehicles in 2030 than they currently own. And I know I have younger children. I have actually a teenager who has said he doesn't think he's going to own a car in the next 10 years. He will likely want to live in an environment where he is able to take public transportation. And I mean, so all of these factors rolling together are really creating a new environment for the energy sector, where we have to figure out what the new normal will be. But one of the ones that I think has been actually the baseline for all of what's happening is this interest in social responsibility. Social responsibility was part of the push for the green energy emergence. It continues to be a big activator in that movement. But social responsibility just isn't limited to ensuring that our generation is green and that we're being planet friendly, but it's also about equity and access. And as you go across the globe, you see more variations of that. When we think about some of the volunteer work that we've done, both Mark and I, in places like Africa, where you can see the huge different access to energy makes in people's lives and their ability to create a profession or to formulate a profession from which they can have a sustainable income for themselves and to create some level of wealth for their family, you start to really understand how impactful access to electricity and to energy is. And then here in the US, where we may be a little further on our path, but when you take a look into certain communities, you can see the stark absence of some of the types of renewable energy that is so prevalent in other parts of the society. So this social responsibility is really becoming a big catalyst in the movement in power trends. So as we come out of just power and we start to speak specifically to green energy and intentionally more about the US, we can focus a lot. We can take a look at what are the areas that we've seen even more growth and more focus. One of them is, of course, in the energy storage area. Mark works specifically in energy storage. I cover it more globally. But for us, energy storage, we've been in the business for quite a few years, and we have actually seen the trend where, energy storage is becoming more impactful in both utilities and in the everyday consumers' lives. We're seeing bigger and much more efficient installations of storage. Storage is, of course, mostly focused for us on chemical storage, lithium-ion batteries. But we shouldn't forget that, there is storage outside of that. We've been using flywheels and pumps for a very long time to do storage. I think the first hydropower station with a pump and flywheel was installed in the 1920s in the US. And that is still, every single hydro dam we have here still has some element of flywheel storage that is pretty efficient. The difference is that those are more tailored towards very large capacity And as we move into the trend of the microgrid and the distributed energy resources, which is more of a decentralized environment, the need for the large capacity is reduced. And what we're looking for is to find more efficiency in smaller forms of technology that would allow us to have, one, the independence, but two, the resiliency and the redundancy that we typically get from some of these larger generation plants. The other piece of this, like I said, was the data analytics and the impact of machine learning and artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence is making waves all across the world in many different industries. So of course, the energy industry is no exception. Here, artificial intelligence is being used to help many energy companies and their consumers collect and sift through all the data to identify all the trends in both generation and consumption. If you think about it, many of you have smart meters at home. There are smart energy management systems that are installed at most utilities, and they're all benefiting from the influence of artificial intelligence. Energy companies, as well as some of their third party and other vendors, are basically doing a lot of data mining. They're really beginning to understand how we use energy and many other things about how we use energy that they can infer to create another level of consumerism. So as these companies begin to adopt AI, it's helping them to also speed up their production, reduce waste, but also to create new platforms and new offerings for us that we're currently not even very interested in. So in the long run, I think the impact of AI is going to be extremely effective in terms of giving us more personalized service in our homes. It should help us to make better decisions about how we use energy. And then there's the impact of the changing business model. And business models won't change if regulation don't change. Regulation and policy is a huge part of this. I'm going to leave that for Mark to address as we talk through what are some of those challenges, because while this is a trend, the trend is that it's specific to the US, we have a lot of policy hurdles that we need to overcome. There are other countries that have done a lot better, so they're much further ahead in their green energy walk, in their ability to really integrate energy in a way that is cost effective for all parties. Another piece of the change in the business model is the use of blockchain. And I'm not a blockchain expert, but what we should understand is specific to energy. The blockchain technology has been having an impact. I know that there are at least 2 microgrids located on the East Coast where blockchain technology has been used to deploy it, and the community has been particularly impressed. This is in Brooklyn and in Queens. But what happens is this energy is used by most of the companies to help to improve the performance of smart energy saving devices. And what they do is they build some kind of management system with it. So most of the utilities that can then take advantage of the distribution ledger that tells you exactly who is using what. So they're better able to track the chain of custody for all of the energy, including the materials that they're using in the grid. So there is some benefit to this, and all this can be done, of course, in real time, because blockchain is, of course, facilitated by data analytics and by machine learning. So all of these are really tied together. But one of the ones that I think we should keep our eyes on, and even outside of the US, this one is still a challenge, is grid parity. And what I mean by grid parity is grid parity occurs when the alternate energy source can generate power at what I'd call the levelized cost of electricity, so that it is less than or equal to the price of power that is coming from the electric grid. So some renewables like solar is becoming more popular, but we do need to recognize that there's been a lot of subsidies through tax incentives and otherwise that have impacted the cost. And so a levelized cost means you need to now remove some of these credits and see what that is. this is going to be very important in the years to come, because as we talk through grid parity, we need to then see what that levelized cost is and whether or not we really can get to that level of efficiency. And this is, of course, tied directly to technological advances. As technology becomes more efficient and is rolled out across more of the US and other countries, we're hoping that this means that fewer resources will be used, hence the cost is reduced, and we should be able to see the kind of improvements we need to make in order to attain parity. Part of this is also the consumer's portion of this, and whether or not they're getting any benefit from localized generation that they may be taking part in at their home, meaning rooftop solar, or maybe they have an EV that they have charged, that they can charge at a cheaper rate and sell it back on the grid at a later rate when rates are high because it's a peak demand hour or something. These are the kind of things that are going to have to be considered as we talk through grid parity. And then, because all of this is digitized, because we're sending information back and forth, and because of the level of information and data that we have, cybersecurity becomes a bigger focus. And I don't want to detract from the need to still focus on physical security, because the truth is that we've become a lot more robust in physical security in this environment. But that was always a concern, and it's always been on our plate as something that we need to address. Cybersecurity is the one that has crept up on us. The recent study we had said one particular utility, just one of the large utilities, had over 20,000 cyber attacks in a single day, in one single day. And I think what that did is there has been the formulation, of course, of something called, NERC-CIP establishment rules, which provides the guidelines for the things we need to do to make sure we have all the necessary gates and checks and balances to protect our very important grid infrastructure. So it probably is the primary downside to digitization of our grid, because the vulnerability to cyber attacks is unprecedented. The US in particular is seen more than anywhere else. There are things that the utilities conduct that are called war games, and they do this from time to time just to do some scenario testing. And it is important because they have to make sure that the system is watertight, to ensure that they can protect against any and all types of barrage that they may receive. So you combine cybersecurity with AI and blockchain, and you probably have the most bulletproof perimeter barrier that you could possibly have for the system.
Hey, Tracy, I'm going to jump in here for 1 second.
Yeah.
We talk about cybersecurity as a trend in energy and power markets. It is also important to look at it that all the blockchain, artificial intelligence, and distributed energy resources are viewed on as being positive. Each of these can be paired as an offensive tool in the cybersecurity space. For example, using artificial intelligence, you can take that job that took 1 or 2 hackers to do, you can digitize it and do massive denial of services and others that are built on that artificial intelligence. So it is a bit of a cycle. And I do think it's important to look at all those. Artificial intelligence is valuable. It is also a threat on the other side of here.
Yeah. Absolutely. And again, this leads into the whole automation piece. And the impact of automation actually is that you have more rapid response, you have removed redundancies, you are able to provide more efficient service, you have built in more resiliency, you typically do have more redundancy built in, but it also means that you are removing traditional jobs. So now you have to talk about the resource planning and how do you now staff for the future? What are the new professions that are going to be emerging as a result of the automation of some of these types of work and tasks that were typically performed by human beings because of the level of efficiency that we're generating? I do want to say one thing about policy, though, before you get into it, Mark, and it's that, policy and politics are very different. So, we don't generally care about politics, but we need to understand that policies infiltrate every part of our lives, and it is no different in the energy sector. So if you live in California and you are so accustomed to being able to install a solar panel and to come in with an EV, and you have a battery system and you're able to get net zero billing, and then you move to certain parts of this country where you are not able to do that because there are no policies in place to support the consumer's role in that type of a transaction, you really start to appreciate why policy becomes an important part of the conversation and why that is a trend in energy, because the consumers before were never really that concerned about policy. So I'm going to leave the policy discussion there and let you take that on a little bit later, Mark. But in the interest of time, we can just very quickly talk through some of the impact. And the impact to the infrastructure is that, yes, there's a lot of money being spent on go back one slide, please, Mark, just before we get to that one. The impact is that on the electric infrastructure, we will be spending more money to modernize. And the objective is at some point, many utilities and cities have committed to going 100% green in dates ranging anywhere from 2025 all the way through to 2040. So what that also means is that we will need to find a different way to help our utilities who are still responsible to ensure that all consumers have reliable and redundant access to electricity. How do we help to ensure that they have a revenue base as more and more customers are moving off of the grid, relying on their own production or on community production? Then, of course, the wireless infrastructure. As the energy system starts to rely on the wireless infrastructure, you're going to see more and more build out. And who gets to maintain that? What happens when the wireless infrastructure is down? Who then has the call out? What does that do to our reliance on energy? That is also going to start to emerge as another gray area where we may potentially see new policies emerge, or even new skill sets that are emerging as the two sectors start to crisscross. And then, of course, transportation. I think many countries have already started to undergo their transition where they're moving many of their public transportation systems over to an electrified one. In fact, some of them have been that way for years. The US is still behind. But I think as you start to look around in your home cities and towns, look at the states you're in, you go and dig into some of their policies, and you'll actually see where there are charters pushing for the electrification of everything from their public buses and other transportation system, all of the government-led or the state-led fleet vehicles. Things like the school buses. I know that in California, there's at least 1 or 2 school districts that have put out RFPs for electric school buses. I think almost every major city in this country has put out an RFP for electric buses for their cities. So this is taking shape. It's taking some time, but it's happening. But in addition to buses and consumer vehicles, we do have to consider logistics and transportation for goods and services. And those are also preparing for automation. So we'll get into that in the next slide where we talk about how all of these trends are merging to create these very new applications of how we engage with technology, but also how power is influencing the technology, the movement in technology. And then critical infrastructure. And this for me is an important one because this again leads to some of the social responsibility piece, but it also speaks very clearly to how another sector is being impacted by power. So there has been an increase in the eco-friendly real estate and housing. And by housing, I don't just mean your home. I'm also talking hospitals, universities, every kind of vertical building that you could think of. And this is a social impact trend that is continuing. We're continuing to see this rise. You combine all of the smart metering that we talked about with this, and you can understand how this could really be impactful in terms of our consumption of electricity. So some of the questions we ask ourselves are things like, is the building made from sustainable material? Can it be hooked up to the grid and taken off the grid when needed? How much carbon footprint does that building have in the construction process? Can we do something to reduce that? Are the windows energy efficient? Can we use the windows to actually generate electricity? Is there LED lighting? Is there sufficient bio-waste that we can create a net zero building? How would you accomplish that in an urban environment? And those are some of the considerations that are being given as we talk about how critical infrastructure is changing. Next slide, Mark. So just to give you a couple of examples of some of the developments. So the US has been in a onshore wind boom for over 25 years. The rapid growth in the capacity of these wind turbines has been phenomenal. I think we're now, recently, it was just this year that GE installed their 10 megawatt, well, that's offshore. GE and I think it's Vestas both have two of the largest onshore turbines right now. These are now at 150 meters. Is the turbine height, and I know we've recently installed a few of these. So if you consider where they've gone in just 20 years, you're talking about more than doubling the height of the wind turbines and the capacity of them. The wind on land in the US is pretty much at about 90% capacity. So what we've been seeing, and the trend specific to wind in the US, has been to offshore wind. So if there are people on here who live in any of the coastal states, especially the Eastern Shore, you may have seen announcements where the Bureau of Ocean Management has actually been leasing all of the viable lots off of the East Coast. And many projects have been either put out for RFP or RFI, or even have been awarded. I think Block Island was one of the first commercially operated offshore wind farm. That one is about 30 megawatts. I know that we've got Ocean Wind, Skipjack. There's several more that are coming. And what is also helping to push this, this part of the sector is the fact that the size of the turbines are changing, but also the technology that they're using. So now, instead of going to fixed turbines, they're actually looking at installing floating turbines, which means that you can actually modify the location of the turbines to increase your capacity without having to increase your investment in the infrastructure. So I thought that was pretty interesting myself. And I mean, as an energy geek, I'll probably just keep nerding out on that. So I'll move on. On the energy storage front, what we're seeing is the decline in the cost of the batteries. And most of what we see in the US, the heavy focus has been on chemical batteries, particularly lithium ion. But there are other things like liquid air storage and so on that are, gaining rapid interest. Lots of money being invested in them. And I suspect that we're going to be seeing more and more parity between liquid storage and chemical storage in the future. I think one of the goals is, if you can get to store as much energy in 1 gallon of gas as you can get in 1 gallon of liquid air, then you have parity between the two. And this is where the market would then take off. So energy storage is seeing a boom here. It's seen a boom all over. Some countries, such as, I would say, China, Japan, much of the EU, they have been the ones who have been really pushing this and have had quite a lot of good results in using energy storage. But here in the US, I would say California has been a big leader in that. And places like New York, places that are either constrained because of their distance from the traditional generating loads, or who have extremely high wheeling costs or utility, whether it's demand costs or just their standard rates. Those are some of the areas where we're seeing the most interest in energy storage, and the ones who are pushing to be bigger, better, and faster. And then, of course, EVs. And the thing about EVs is that they don't just impact, they also impact the infrastructure. We're talking roads, bridges, tunnels, and the amount of work that has to go into ensuring that these mediums for transportation have the right infrastructure in place so you can maximize the potential. So for example, many people don't know that there's actually a corridor in Columbus, Ohio, where they test electric vehicles. It has all the sensors, it has installed installed copper, so we can have an electromagnetic field. So at some point when they have cars that can be charged just through magnetization, that will be one of the areas that they will be testing it. But there's going to be a lot of improvement to the infrastructure in the US in order to get us to that place where we can see widespread use of EVs across our economy. And then some of the other things to consider is the fact that we tend to focus a lot on the technologies and the trends that we see most popular in the US. But there are other places in the world that are actually well ahead of us when it comes to energy. For example, floating solar farms, extremely popular in the United Arab Emirates, in Israel and other places, Japan, India, I think are others. And this is being pushed by these areas where they have heavy congestion already in their large urban areas. And so they have to find another way of trying to generate electricity from the natural resources. So this is one option, especially when you're surrounded by that much water, it becomes more important. Another one is, of course, tidal wave technology. And this one is a pro and a con. Some people think that, of course, there is an impact to wildlife in the ocean, similar to many people thinking there's an impact to wind turbines in terms of birds and so on. So there's always this balancing act that you play between the benefit and, of course, the impact. And that is no different for some of these technologies. So I think this is as much as I'm able to say in this short time. It's just something to tease your appetite. I'm sure we'll have opportunities to do more deep dives as we move on. I'm going to turn it over to Mark so he can talk a little bit more about, so if these are the trends, then what are some of the challenges that may slow down the adaptation of these trends? So Mark, it's all yours.
Thank you, Tracy. So as Tracy opened up, there really are a number of challenges to the clean energy transition and this transformation of people's lives, of the community that will serve. However, none of these challenges are insurmountable. They're being addressed on a daily basis throughout the world, whether it's in your local community, regional organizations, global organizations. These are all issues that are being addressed, but they are issues that we need to keep at top of mind and work through as we move forward. So the first area we'd really like to look at is the and established framework. So in many parts of the world, the regulatory framework of the energy markets and energy policy is not as well developed as it is in the US or Europe or certain other areas. So when we take a look at that, that regulatory framework uncertainty allows capital to flow into certain projects and capital to flow into the development of these industries. So when we take a look at Africa, for example, you don't necessarily have the regulatory framework in place in many of these countries. So you can see creation of certain collaborative power pools and groups. One good example that both Tracy and I have had experience with is NELSAP, the Nile Equatorial Lakes Subsidiary Action Program. It's really a collaboration of certain countries in Eastern Africa. It's a vehicle for investment, cross-border regional collaboration. So generation is getting pushed in the right places, transmission line is being built out in the correct area, and it also involves training for local utilities and local groups. But at the end of the day, you still see, although you have these cross-country collaborations, you still see energy policy and regulatory frameworks being constructed on a local country-specific level. In the US, you may see it in individual states or even with an RTO or ISO policies, but there's typically not an overarching national policy across the board in many of these countries. And it doesn't always focus on the ability to collaborate with other communities outside your national boundaries. So really building up that framework of the regulatory power in energy markets in places like Africa or Central Asia is really going to be critical to bringing clean energy transition into some of those areas. and allowing them to a certain degree leapfrog current technologies that are in place and capitalize on really that cutting edge infrastructure.
Yeah. Mark, go ahead. I was going to say, I do want to say that for the US, we need to keep in mind though that because the federal government does not necessarily come out and own or make investment into the infrastructure, we have to recognize that we are behind some countries when it comes to regulation and helping to move the clean energy path ahead. It is quite an act. So I know that in 2019 there was a tax bill that was referred to that's called the Green Act, and that was introduced to extend and expand the existing renewable tax credits and incentives that are actually expiring. So again, this is a role where politics and policy are impacting energy. And one of the things I always try to point out, and Mark and I do this, is it's not just the developing nations. We are actually probably further away from having a really centralized approach to how to provide or how to get access or how to finance or how to propel renewable energy because of the type of government system that we have and the fact that states and not just the states.
Yeah. Statewide, we have essentially 50 different energy policies and energy constructs between different states. And that's what adds the complexity here. So Tracy brings up a very good point. I mean, we have our challenges here as well as overseas. I do want to make sure we get some of that overseas flavor because that is one of the core tenets of the council.
Yeah.
One of the other challenges we look at is environmental impacts. So although clean energy has a lot of different benefits to it, some of these technologies are developing and they have not necessarily gotten to the point where they are part of the circular economy. And when I say circular economy, that means the product is constructed, it's put into service, it's used through its useful lifetime, and then is recycled or reused. Certain technologies like storage, battery recycling is not really necessarily mainstream. There are a lot of different constructs in a lot of different places looking at making this cost effective, but that is an issue that we are going to have to deal with as this becomes plays a greater role in our economy. Now that may be recycling, that may be a second life. On the previous slide, we referenced Johan Cruyff Stadium in Amsterdam. It's a really interesting project where they took a couple hundred Nissan Leaf batteries from the vehicle, incorporated it into an energy storage service for the stadium, and that provides ancillary services and auxiliary power backup for the facility. So it's a really creative and interesting way of utilizing those batteries and creating that second life and the circular economy. Another example, and it's not just energy storage, it would be at the useful life ends for turbines. What do we do with those blades? That is a very unique problem. Tracy can probably address that a little bit more, but that's something that we'll be considering how to deal with as these get bigger and more costly. A couple other things that are really interesting when you look at the environmental impacts. So, and here's the positive side. A lot of these industries are looking at corporate responsibility initiatives. Your state and local utility and regulatory bodies are requiring social responsibility initiatives, are requiring money down for recycling.
We can't hear Mark. Can you hear us, Mark?
I can. Tracy, can you? All right.
Mark, I can hear you just fine now.
Sorry about that. Mark is having, Sarah, we can't hear you either.
Tracy, I think it might just be you. Samantha, you can hear me, right?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead?
So you do see an increase in corporate responsibility initiatives, increased focus on life cycle analytics, and then a focus on the industry looking at reducing its carbon footprint, which are all extremely valuable portions of this. Also like to talk a little bit about supply chain constraints. With the clean energy transition, you are seeing a very massive industry build out. That might be distributed energy resources. It may be wind, solar.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, Tracy.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. So
Right.
it seems like we're having some technical difficulty, guys. So we can hear neither Mark nor Samantha at this point. So I'm going to try to help to carry this home until someone else can step in here. We were talking quite a bit about the lack of regulatory certainty. The next one, of course, is on the supply chain constraints. And a big part of that is because much of the elements in our renewable technology, specifically in things like battery and so on, are actually rare minerals that we rely on. You add to that the fact that the location of some of these materials, not just the rare minerals, but other materials, are in countries with which we rely on having healthy trade agreements. And you start to understand why supply chain can become an issue. This is not just restricted again to the US, but this is globally across the entire spectrum for all of the participants. And it's everything from even our ability to start to track each element of the chain, all the way up to the buildup of the larger piece of equipment. I mentioned about the use of data and how we're using data, mining the data to be more corporately responsible. Because of that kind of responsibility, we're seeing some of these constraints emerge even further, because we recognize the challenge with ensuring that the sourcing of material is done in a way that is socially responsible. So that is also another reason for some of the impact on the supply chain. And then, of course, that also leads to the environment impact. We talked already about mining, but what we have not addressed is the fact that we haven't really figured out what end-of-life storage looks like for a lot of this equipment. You know, whether that is our turbines, blades, the batteries, as Mark mentioned, the fact that we were able to reuse some, but there is a point where there is not sufficient capacity in that battery. Now, what do we do with them? This to us would be tantamount to the same effect of say, nuclear waste. The carbon life cycle of some of these is quite long, and actually is part of the research that's taking place to see what is the life cycle cost of the green energy compared to the life cycle cost of fossil energy when you look at total carbon footprint. And that is a question that has not yet been answered. And I suspect that that's something that we're going to see emerge more and more, especially as the social responsibility piece starts to emerge further.
Hey, Tracy.
Mark, I still can't hear you. Can't hear you. And then, of course, there's the capital build out and the skills misalignment. And a big piece of that is that when you talk about traditionally, we had the need for tons of linemen, a lot of external work crew who were accustomed to working in a particular environment. Many of those, just me? Okay.
All right, so I'm going to finish this off, and then we can just open up to questions. Last topic we had to discuss is capital build-out and skills misalignment. Typically, these are large capital-intensive projects. Repayment periods are fairly substantial to make back on these projects. Typically, you also do have a very long development process to get through permitting, financing, engineering, and construction. And there's substantial risk as you work through this. In some cases, transmission line projects in the US, your development period may be 5, 10, or more years. And so you look at the amount of upfront capital that's required. And so that is one of the concerns as you go forward. And Tracy mentioned policy earlier, making sure policies are correct and not correct, but policies are in place that allow for the build out of essential clean energy and allow for this build out of this transition. And that may be domestically or maybe internationally. When you look at certain locations, it's harder to bring in different companies. Different companies may or may not work in certain areas. maybe more difficult to get capital to support these projects, whether it be from the European Bank, the African Development Bank, other areas as well. That does cross many, many borders and areas. And then really the last one's skills misalignment. And this one's particularly interesting. I referenced earlier NELSAP, but there's U.S. U.S. Agency for International Development has a Power Africa initiative in conjunction with other federal agencies. You have the U.S. Energy Association that runs their Energy Partnership Program, and NARUC. And each of these programs, they bring skills, they bring training overseas into a lot of these different areas to help progress this clean energy transition or progress the electrification of those areas. And I think that's especially important because when we look at the capital build out and the requirements of these projects, this is also, they do require specialized skills. And those may be specialized skills in project management, specialized skills in grid operations, engineering operations, power market development, regulatory analysis, and regulatory frameworks. These are specialized skills that, I mean, it's taken time domestically for us to build up some of these capabilities. And in some areas, we are still working on that development. But you also take a look at overseas, these programs will help bring those skills and align those skills with some of the complexities that we see from AI, blockchain, energy markets, and the development of these large capital projects. So that is also a challenge. And here again, that's a little bit of a global focus, but it is a challenge we see domestically as well, while we're looking to staff up jobs and bringing in appropriate trade, craft members to work on these projects, or leadership to work through some of these complicated issues that are tied with microgrids and cybersecurity. So it's really the skills transfer and align those skills with new projects. So that is really, there are a lot of challenges here, but we started off the discussion today on energy being transformational. And I think that's really where I'd like to wrap this up and tie it back to is that we have the ability to work through this clean energy transition and make a transformational impact on the individuals in these communities, our own communities, and our societies in general. So I do want to say thank you to the Pacific Council for allowing us to come speak today. Thank you for Samantha for helping to facilitate today, but open up to questions.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Tracy. Sorry for those technical difficulties we had. Hopefully everything is back to normal now. I'd like to ask Mark a quick question. So over the past few decades, and as we all know, we're facing a serious threat of climate change, climate disasters. There has, of course, been this increasing attention on the transition to green energy. And it's generally thought that we're moving in the right direction. You mentioned a lot of the positive things, but you also mentioned a lot of the drawbacks to this clean energy transition. A common goal in the EU and other regions is for us to reach the net zero emissions by around 2050. I know Tracy had mentioned 2025 to 2040 as well. I know different regions have different goals. But from what you see in the field, Mark, how feasible do you think this is? And with your role, what would you say is the one most important hurdle that we face coming into this?
That's a good question. And here, that's a very difficult question to address. Everybody has a slightly different perspective on this. I think it would be hard for me to be able to pick a date that out of the sky that says this is a date we need to target. I think any effort that we make towards a clean energy transition are valuable, they're needed, and we should be progressing in that direction. But my goal here today is that there are going to be difficult discussions along that way, and there are going to be a bit of a give and take as we work through this. This isn't anything that we as a society or community can't work our way through. And can't put the technology, the capital, the human knowledge and capital behind it to work through it. But it's going to be challenging. I would say the biggest challenge see on a day-to-day is I'm going to defer that one to Tracy and see where she comes up.
Can you ask the question again? Because I was confident you were going to answer that.
It's basically just, what is the biggest hurdle out of all of the ones that we've mentioned? What is the biggest hurdle to getting to net zero emissions by a specific date, 2050 in particular?
I'm going to follow with Mark where it says it's hard to give a global response. I think what we have to ask ourselves is region by region, what would be the challenge? Because I would say the EU is in a very different place than where, you know, some of the developing nations are. And then you compare that to the US, each state is even in a very different. So for example, one would argue that maybe California gets to net zero before New York City does, or New York gets there before Texas does. The challenges are, one is the regulatory piece, but two, it's the access and equity piece. Because in order for you to get to net zero, we need to all agree on what net zero means. Is it net zero for the utility? Is it net zero for the consumer? Right now, net zero is looked at more from the utility perspective. And there are utilities here who actually think that they could get to net zero, like I said, California, in the next 20 years. But you'll have consumers who will say that won't happen because I don't have a solar panel on my building. It's not going to happen. I live in public housing. So for me, I think regulations are going to be the biggest. And that seems to be a little bit more universal, but I do believe where you are on that spectrum is absolutely related to where in the world you reside.
I'd follow that up with the diversity of the marketplace too. When you look through the marketplace, whether it be in the US or globally, or even locally, state by state, you have some extremely rural areas, you have highly dense urban areas. Those solutions don't necessarily match the two. And you also have a certain amount of, for lack of a better term, the NIMBYism, the not in my backyard. Unfortunately, to put in some distributed energy resources, you typically need additional capital infrastructure such as transmission or distribution. And that does impact people's daily lives, their property and such. And that's getting those projects through has become increasingly difficult in certain areas of the country and in the world. Yeah. And I would say that's an additional constraint. Now here again, nothing that can't be worked through. We can't have a good dialogue to get past to find appropriate solution, but it does make that challenge a bit more difficult in some regards.
Right. I think it's become increasingly more clear ever since the Paris Climate Agreement came out, and people have not been able to really even keep up with what they've promised, just because you've seen the broadness of the subject, and it's almost impossible to tackle, especially for the more developing countries. So
yeah,
we do have a specific question related to this as well from a member that asks, are there any successful city or country examples that have switched to a full alternative energy source at an LCOE and have cyber threats under control? Is Tracy saying no?
None that I'm aware of, because cyber threats under control, we would have to define what that means, right? Does that mean they are able to stop? Because you have different levels of penetration, which then results in different levels of disruption. So the idea would be, where in the stage are you actually able to capture and trace? Because that's a big part of it too, in order to prevent. I would say, no, I am not aware. It doesn't mean some small city, town, or municipality may not elsewhere, but I can tell you here in the US, every single utility right now is still being bombarded. We have outages and brownouts, and they're putting out fires constantly because people have been able to find ways to interrupt the day-to-day activities or normal activities. So I don't think we're there yet, because we're not fully digitized yet either, right? So where you're not seeing a lot of activities, that's because they still have a very closed network that they're operating in. They still have not gone mainstream with the full rollout of data analytics and the artificial intelligence and the digitization So I would say we're not able to make a true evaluation of that statement yet. Come back in about 4 years.
Yeah, I would like to tack on one more thing with the levelized cost of energy and our earlier question on, climate change goals and such. I think the important question to ask at the end of the day, and I'm not sure it's necessarily been addressed, is what does success look like? I mean, if we pick zero emissions, we pick, reducing carbon, what does that success look like? Because it's going to probably be different in different places based on whether individual community has access to electricity and clean energy versus a community that's well developed, that has institutional and historical requirements around that. So I think that question of what is success is really part of this, and it may be levelized cost of energy in certain locations. It may be social mobility. It may be community. It may be, it could be a lot of different things. And I don't think across the board it's all going to be the same.
Right. And it's not just levelized cost. So we're going to dig, we're going to get like into this rabbit hole, but it's not just levelized cost of energy. It's also levelized avoided cost of electricity. So, I mean, this thing could just get, the point is that we have to really get to a global definition of how we assess and evaluate it and what that really means. And we're not there. We're not there. It's too early.
The one point I do want to hit home, though, is we're talking a lot about challenges, and there's a difficult road ahead. And in some ways it is. But I also do want to highlight the huge amount of possibilities, the positives that Tracy walked into today, the efforts that we've seen from organizations, whether it be USAID, Power Africa, U.S. Energy Association, NARUC, any of these other groups to help further these policies. Those are really, really valuable programs and making the difference on a day-to-day basis to forward the clean energy transition. And I think at times we focus so much on the size and the scope of the project. There are amazing, exciting, just vibrant efforts being made on a local and community level, which is very impressive here. And that should give us all hope as we move forward.
Okay, great. I'm going to choose one more question. We have a couple more questions, but we don't have quite enough time. So maybe it will be possible for us to get in contact with the people who are asking the questions afterwards to be able to answer the more specific questions. But the one I'd like to address here is by Jesse. What do you see as the most pressing legal and regulatory challenges that we need to overcome as we transition?
I think Mark and I are going to disagree. So
go ahead, Tracy.
So we have to look at the way the utility system and how they recoup cost was developed over the years, and it was really to impact mostly the bottom line for the utility, not so much the consumer. For me, I think one of the biggest challenges is going to be the fact that the new technology that we have, right? And the technology that's to come that we have not yet fully captured offers benefits in the power and energy market that we do not yet have a way of even capturing and allocating a cost or a dollar value to. Until you can get some understanding around that and about how that is different than the way power was generated back then and how we built the cost basis for that, which then led to some of the policies, I don't think we're going to get there. I mean, so being able to recognize that we do need to have some redefinitions of roles and responsibilities and how we're evaluating value on the grid and value to the consumer is going to be fundamental to getting us moving on the policy. That is my piece on it. Mark.
Tracy, this is going to be surprising to you, but I completely agree with you. I would say one other aspect of this that we need to really look at, and this isn't necessarily in the US, but globally, is in some places a lack of a regulatory framework. And helping to put that regulatory framework, having those good discussions, and watching those institutions and frameworks being built, I think that will lead to further development additional adaptation of the clean energy and moving this transition. But really, if there's no framework and there's no planning, you end up in a situation where, you know, transmission lines don't necessarily match up. You have wheeling charges between states and countries. You don't have necessarily the best or most efficient allocation of resources, and increased impacts where you may not want them. So I do agree with Tracy, absolutely. But the second piece is in place is not having that appropriate framework.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm glad we were
still being
able to come to a consensus at the end. I'm sorry we ran out of time. We ran a few minutes over, but thank you both for sharing your time and your expertise with us. This was a very intriguing conversation. Thanks to all the members and guests for joining us. The council will continue with their virtual programming over the next few weeks. The next one, I believe their advertising is on Wednesday, July 1st for a webcast on the future of Hong Kong.
Okay.
You can also go to pacificcouncil.org to see more about that. Thank you for everyone. We're going to end the webcast right now. I hope you all have a great day.
Copy the questions and send them over so we can see. Yeah. All right. Very good. Thanks, guys. Bye.